am very excited to have our friends at Silicon Valley Bank as the sponsor of this live recording of What It Takes with Stephen Lacey. SVB is Powerhouse's bank. It is Powerhouse Ventures Bank. It is the bank of the climate tech industry. And that is one of the many reasons that it's my pleasure to introduce Dan Baldy. Dan, I think we're going to make it through this year. I wasn't sure, but we're close. And
Oh,
it's
we
nice to see
certainly
you.
are, and it's can't come too soon, right? So looking forward to that. Thanks for having us here today, Emily. I'm Dan Baldy with Silicon Valley Bank, and at SVB, we strive to be the bank and financing partner of choice to the tech and life sciences industries and the venture capital and private equity community that supports it. As you mentioned, I run the energy and resource innovation practice here, and we're proud to support technologies developing or entrepreneurs developing innovative technologies to transform the way that we produce, store, and consume energy, the way that we move people and goods around the globe, and the way that we produce food for the world to eat. It's our pleasure to be here today and associate with you, Emily, and the great team at Powerhouse. The community building you do and the company building you do is something that we really like to be associated with. So thanks for the opportunity. Wish everyone a happy holidays and a better 2021. So with that, thanks, and back to you.
Well said, Dan. Thanks. You're the best. Appreciate everything SVB does for us and for the industry, and appreciate your support for What It Takes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so welcome again to Powerhouse. Welcome to What It Takes. I'm Emily Kirsch, founder and CEO of Powerhouse and founder and managing partner of Powerhouse Ventures. It's such an honor to have the founder and executive producer of the Energy Gang and the Interchange, Stephen Lacey, with us today. Stephen, welcome to the show.
So delighted to be here.
I'm so happy to have you here. I'm especially excited because, as you know, we have some really big news to announce about What It Takes. So
we do.
This is perfect timing for the end of the year. You took a bet on me. You took a bet on Powerhouse 3 years ago when we launched What It Takes. And so today we're really excited to announce that we are spinning out What It Takes to be its own standalone podcast, which we're going to be producing with you and your new company, Postscript Audio. We're also excited to share that we have just surpassed 1 million downloads of What It Takes, which is really hard to believe, but a testament to all of our awesome work together over the past 3 years. For those of you here, if you want to keep hearing What It Takes, and if you want to help ensure that our foray into the podcast wilderness is a success, you can play a really important role by subscribing to the new feed, and you can find it by searching What It Takes, that's WATT, What It Takes on your favorite podcasting app, or by going to powerhouse.fund, FUND /podcast.
Yeah, people have really responded to the series. So excited to bring it into a new format, really ramp it up. And I'm super excited about it.
I am as well. And for all of those who are listening, we recorded that as part of what will air in the new year. The new feed is actually not live yet, but it will be in January. So in the meantime, we're not actually announcing this publicly, so you're the first to hear it. But we will be posting publicly once the stream is live. But for now, you can keep listening to us on the Energy Gang until the spring. But yeah, Stephen, I just want to thank you for being our partner in crime and building What It Takes. It's been an amazing journey, and I'm really excited to continue this journey with you in its new form.
Same. The feeling is absolutely mutual, and the show is a real delight and a service to people.
Thank you. Well, I'm happy you said yes to joining. You were a little hesitant to say yes when I first asked. Why were you hesitant?
How could I grace the stage with so many successful clean tech entrepreneurs? I mean, these are the people that we talk to, who we learn from, and these are the people that I've learned from over the years. So I don't know. I just was a little bit hesitant to share my story because I'm just at the beginning of my own entrepreneurial journey.
Well, you've been the voice for the industry for a long time, so I'm grateful that you did say yes. What ultimately made you say yes?
Well, I have seen the evolution of the industry for the last decade and a half, and I have been at this really interesting intersection of podcasting, a fast-growing medium, and the clean tech space. So I feel like I've had this bird's eye view of how things have evolved. So I felt like I could offer something.
You definitely can. What's it like being on the show now that you're on it?
Oh, I'm nervous. I'm
We were
always
talking
nervous
about
when
this.
someone's interviewing me.
It's weird when the tables are turned. People are like, "When are you going to be on the podcast?" I'm like, "Never." It's hard. It's hard being on the other side of the mic. This
Yeah,
is easier. Like my
we were
job is easier.
saying we were saying it doesn't matter how prepared I am for anything. When I go on stage, when I press record, when I'm being interviewed, the physicality of being nervous always hits me. So it's about
Same.
managing it, not necessarily getting rid of it.
Yeah, it usually takes me a good like 5 minutes or so to kind of settle in. But this feels very meta to be interviewing the interview master. So I just want you to know how much admiration and respect I have for you and everything that I've learned from you in this podcast journey. So thank you again for saying yes.
Thank you so much. Honored.
Yeah. All right, back to you and where you were born, which was Keene, which is in rural New Hampshire. Your mom worked at a steel fabrication plant where she was the only woman in a company of men for pretty much her entire time there. She worked her way up from a secretary to a general manager to a vice president and managed 60 men while raising you and your brother. What influence did your parents have on you?
Both parents were very influential. My mom definitely gave me a window into what it was like to be a really hard worker and was a role model for um, I think a very strong woman. And
Mm.
she worked in a male dominated industry, played a hard-nosed manager role and a mother to a lot of steel fabrication workers, and worked tirelessly, really long hours. And it was only really later in life that I realized I picked up a lot of my work ethic from her. So
Mm.
having that as an example was really influential. My father was a forester and then he went into real estate. And so being in the forest, I would go onto property and go, look, he would help me name trees, and we would
Mm.
go run the boundaries of properties in the woods of New Hampshire. And so that gave me an early exposure to being out in nature constantly.
Mm.
So the two of them uh, had very direct roles in my interests and
Makes
behaviors.
Makes sense. Your interchange co-host Shail Khan said that you're one of the hardest working people that he knows, and learning more about your mom and your parents, it makes sense why that is the case.
Yes, and to my detriment sometimes.
Yeah,
Sometimes I can't let go of work.
yeah. We will definitely talk about that. I feel like a lot of us are feeling that way, especially in light of COVID. As a teenager, as you described it, you were privately rebellious, which I love that description, but also very studious. And as you said, constantly outdoors. Who was Stephen Lacey in high school, and what role did movies and the media play in your life at that time?
Well, I'm a typical Gemini, so I have two personalities. One is the professional personality that people in school, in high school, and in college, and parents would see, and then the other is the more rebellious side. So a lot of people are surprised by that when they see me in my natural habitat when the mic isn't turned on or I'm not in a classroom. High school was really influential for me because that's when I got into filmmaking. I got my first access to cameras and first exposure to script writing. And
Mm.
we had a small group of people in high school who were really into um, making films and doing it very seriously. I mean, we look back
Mm.
on them now and they're not particularly good, but we had a management structure in place to
Wow.
actually create things. And we had regular meetings and we would plan them out. And so it wasn't to us like this fun little thing we would do off in the woods. We were really
Mm.
serious about it. So
Mm.
that early exposure made me super passionate about media and storytelling pretty early on.
Hmm. It's all coming together. You graduated from Franklin Price University, which is a small
Franklin
university.
Pierce.
Oh, Franklin Pierce. Thank you. Franklin Pierce University, a small university in your home state of New Hampshire in 2006, with a degree in journalism with a focus in digital media production. You lived with your parents and commuted all 4 years of college, and your peers saw you as very studious and kind of straight edge. Why journalism, and what were your college years like?
Well, I was into the idea of fiction writing and producing films, and I initially went because I wanted to get into filmmaking. Franklin Pierce had just gotten a massive investment into a new digital media center. So they had all
Hmm.
these huge editing bays, a lot of access to equipment, and they were giving freshmen immediate access to that equipment. So I knew I could build something right away. But what I realized is that I'm not very good at fiction writing. I'm good at story construction and understanding what makes a good story, but ultimately, like, the creative juices weren't flowing very well, and so I would look back at stuff that I was doing, and I wasn't very happy with it. But
Mm,
I was really good at talking to people, and I
mm,
was really interested in news and politics from a pretty early age. And once I realized that, like, I could draw out other people's stories and
mm,
use those same kind of techniques to develop nonfiction stories and documentary
mhm,
style stories and interviews, that was really when it clicked for me.
mm. While in college, you interned for Talk Radio News Service, where you covered congressional hearings and White House press briefings. You were only 19 years old, yet you had a pass to go basically anywhere in Congress, and you took advantage of it by attending every congressional hearing that you could. You told me that your most joyous moment of this internship was attending the correspondence dinner. What happened at that dinner, and how did this internship at 19 years old shape your career?
I mean, it was really the window into everything else that came, because their business model required interns to do all the work. So it
Mm,
was really one person who directed an army of interns to go gather tape around Washington, D.C., cut
mm,
that tape, and then send it out to news segments on talk radio stations. And then she would get on at the end of the day or in the morning and talk about what was happening in DC. So I
mm,
got to go to all sorts of hearings all around Congress. I had just free reign anywhere I wanted to go. And every day it was a new assignment, both at think tanks and on
mm,
Capitol Hill. So I was under pressure to have familiarity with the tech. I had to get the tape right. I had to select the right tape and know how to cut it so that we could send it to the radio stations. And
mm,
then at the end of that internship, I got this opportunity to attend the White House Correspondents' Dinner with the presidential motorcade. So part of my responsibilities was going to the White House press briefings, gathering tape there, and then going down into the tiny little studio in the basement and sending that off. Um, During the day that we went to the press briefing, the White House Correspondents' Dinner, I got to sit in the White House all day, hang around with, the camera people and the journalists. Many of these folks are real cowboys. They're like crusty cowboys who've been there for 30 years, and they kind of sit around sharing war stories and
mm,
chewing the cud, so to speak. And I got this kind of backstage exposure to how it really works on the media
mm,
side, which was super
mm,
influential. At the end of the day, the presidential motorcade ran up and outruns the White House staff and outruns the press pool. And we got in the different cars, and George W. Bush is a few cars up from me. And we pull up to the hotel, and out we run. And we're getting into the building. We rush through security. And on my right is Condoleezza Rice. And on my left is then White House Chief of Staff Andy Card. And for me, it was exciting because I had exposure to these people with power, but
mm,
I got to see how they were interacting with each other. I got to see how the inside of the process worked. And it was like, oh, these people are just human beings, just like
mm,
anybody else. And so it actually took away the luster a little bit in a
hmm,
in a healthy way.
hmm,
Um, and I think getting exposure to that early on helped me realize, like, the humanness to people, even people in
hmm,
power.
hmm. Based on that experience, what advice would you have for people who are currently interns, and what advice would you have for people who are managing interns?
Well, for people who are managing interns, you got to give them some responsibility. And
Mm.
so over the years at the various jobs that I've held, any intern who's come in, I've thrown them into responsibilities. And very often they do a poor job from the start, but you have to have patience to be able to
Mm,
walk them through what they're doing wrong. And more likely than not, they're going to do a better job, and they're going to do dramatically better work. And
mm,
so I just implore anybody who is hiring interns not to see them as, peons who should be
mm.
doing the most minimal tasks. They should really
Mm.
have some responsibility. And now we know you should pay your interns too. So if anybody has interns, you should probably pay them.
Yeah,
I'm very
including
passionate
at the
about
White
that.
House.
Yes, exactly. I did not get
Yeah.
paid for that job, but I didn't care. I mean, at that stage, people weren't really paying interns. For interns who are coming into companies, I mean, you, you obviously have to do what you're told and try to do it well, but don't be afraid of asking for more responsibility, because very often, if you show that enthusiasm, people will give it.
Mm, well said. Following graduation in 2006, you got a job as editor and producer at the online magazine Renewable Energy World, where you were paid an annual salary of $25,000 to start your first podcast, which was called Inside Renewable Energy. Where did your interest at that time in renewable energy come from? And your experience with podcasting, like how similar, different was that from the internship work?
Now that I'm thinking of it, I think it was $27,000, and uh, it sounds low now, but it's probably more than most podcasters make. So,
Good point. Good point.
so it was a really amazing experience because, like the talk radio news service internship, I was just thrown into it.
Mhm.
I had a real passion for the environment and environmental science. Even though I wasn't great at the environmental science part of it, it
Mhm.
was something that was really interesting to me. So environmentalism had played an influential role, but I knew nothing about clean tech. I knew nothing about the
Mm,
energy business. It was not something that was really on my radar. In fact, I was applying for, local newspaper jobs. I was willing to report on basically anything. And I applied to talk radio stations. I mean, really any kind of exposure that I could get. And there was a small outfit in Peterborough, New Hampshire called Renewable Energy Access at the time. They had started in the late 90s called Solar Access. They were the first true business publication covering the early solar industry and then later renewables. And the CEO and the co-founder, Jim Callahan, who was a real mentor of mine, had launched an early podcast, and they had been experimenting with it, and they needed someone to ramp it up and take it on full time. And so I was like, okay, I think I can do this. I've been the manager of the radio station in college, and I went in and they took a gamble on me. I mean, I
mm,
had never made a podcast. I didn't know anything about clean tech, but they said, like, we just need a young person who thinks they can do this, and we're going to give you reign to do this. And once again, I was thrown into the deep end, and that's how I got my start in clean tech. I had to force myself to learn every single day and really, uncover very complicated subjects and communicate those quickly.
It sounds familiar for, I think, every person who has come up in this industry. 5 years later, you joined the Center for American Progress, the progressive think tank, where you were hired as deputy editor, providing progressive commentary on climate science and politics. You were there for just under 2 years before leaving to join Green Tech Media, where from 2013 to 2018, you were editor in chief, during which time you launched both the Energy Gang and the Interchange podcasts. Why did you leave Center for American Progress, and what led you to Green Tech Media?
Well, what led me to Center for American Progress was this desire to talk more about climate change. So at
Mhm.
Renewable Energy World, it was
Mm,
purely focused on the business of renewables, which was very attractive to me. I always liked the business lens, and I was comfortable there. But
mm,
there was a broader climate conversation that was really starting to materialize in Washington, and I liked the idea of talking about climate politics and climate science. When I got there, I absolutely loved everyone at the Center for American Progress, and I had a great relationship with my boss, Joe Rome, at the time. But what I was a little concerned about, and ultimately one of the reasons why I left, was that a lot of that information gathering was seen through the lens of like political operations,
mm,
like how to operationalize information in service of
mm,
political ends.
mm,
And I didn't really feel comfortable doing that. I mean, I still had this kind of traditional journalist feeling. Like I didn't like the idea of disseminating information for a political party. Um,
mhm,
and while I do fall on the left side of the spectrum, I don't really fall into any particular party, so to speak.
mhm,
So I left with a desire to go back into business reporting because I
mhm,
felt like that's where a lot of the momentum was happening. And I had been following Green Tech Media since the early days. I mean, they launched in 2007 and they were immediately on my radar, and I was constantly
mm,
reading them. And they had this really fresh take on
mm,
how the money was moving around, how deals were getting developed, how companies were growing. And that spoke to me. And that's why I moved back from sort of the political side into the business side.
mm. Makes sense. In your first year at Green Tech Media in 2013, you launched the Energy Gang. How did the podcast come to be?
Well, Scott Clavena, who is the former CEO and the co-founder of Green Tech Media, had been playing around with a podcast, and it was an interview show, and it wasn't quite landing. And I joined, and we were both talking about, okay, what kind of audio can we do? He knew he was all amped up on podcasts, and he knew that I really wanted to launch a show as well. But we didn't really have a good idea, and so we let it slide for a little while. And then one day, I got a call from Jigger Shah, and I was, really nervous when Jigger called me, and he's like, "Hey, I had listened to your podcasts for the last 5 years.
That
Do
was a
you want
really
to
good
start a
Jigger
podcast?"
imitation.
He
Hey.
just said it. He just called me up and he's like, "Hey, I want to start a podcast. What do I, and we had talked about podcasts in the past, at conferences, like we'd had some back and forth, and we both listened to the Slate Political Gab Fest, which was one of the first political roundtable shows that's still ongoing. One of the first shows I ever listened to, a really fantastic model. You have three experts, journalists who are talking about a particular subject, and you develop a relationship with those three people who are talking about what's in the news. And he was like, why don't we just follow that model? Why don't we talk about what's going on in the business world of clean tech or in politics and bring the three same co-hosts on and just see what happens? We had been working with Kathryn Hamilton at the time, who's our other co-host, on a bunch of grid stuff. So she was at the Gridwise Alliance at the time. We were developing a new grid edge business at Green Tech Media, and we had had a lot of relationships, and we were developing projects with her. And she was like the perfect fit because she knew the policy world really well, and she knew the grid tech side of things. She'd been in venture capital, she'd been a line woman early in her career. She knew the policy landscape very well, so she was just like the perfect, well-rounded person to bring on as the third co-host. And that's how it came together. It didn't land well at first, but then people developed a relationship with us, and that built over time.
What did it what did it sound like in the early days?
Well, it was terrible. We were all on Skype. It was recorded on one stream. So instead of like three separate tracks, I mean, just really basic stuff that seems so silly now, but we just recorded a Skype call together. I actually recorded myself locally, but Jigger and Kathryn were on a Skype line. We were, sometimes the VoIP line would like get really terrible, and the quality isn't good. But I cringe listening to myself. I mean, you can listen to all these. If you want to go back way in the feed, you can hear how different the show is. I was so nervous. I had just been doing interviews for a long time. So I was nervous about being a host that had to have a take, or at least had to facilitate takes in real time. So I showed up and I had like these pages of notes that I wanted to read, and I had these intros, and the intros are way too long. And then like the points I want to make, I'm so nervous about Jigger coming after me that I like have to have like 3 pages of rebuttals. And then over time, you just get more comfortable with the dynamic, and you let the dynamic kind of feed you into what you're going to talk about. And so that took about a year to really evolve, but it doesn't sound very good compared to what you hear today.
Speaking of being afraid of Jigger coming after you, I learned something in preparation for this podcast that shook me, which is you and Jigger's, your antagonism between each other is intentional. It stressed me out so much. And I was like, man, are they okay? And now I know that it was actually intentional. So I appreciate that secret to success of kind of like people like, most people like it. I don't know. It was tough for me, but I'm happy to know that it's all with love.
It is intentional and very much with love. And at first, Jigger would have these long takes that we were unsure how to respond to, because Kathryn and I hadn't really developed the relationship with like how much do we push back. And then I just realized like, okay, every time Jigger makes a point, I'm just going to try to disagree with him. And we talked through that, and it became very explicit. And so a lot of the arguments back and forth are very real in real time. They're not planned, but we have an agreement that like we're probably just going to say, no, you're wrong, or here's why I see this differently, and try to create some kind of drama. I mean, and that's really what's important. The differences between the characters are what make people want to listen. It's not just the information, it's that you're saddling up to the kitchen table with people who have slightly different perspectives, and you want to hear how those different perspectives react to each other.
You were 22 years old when, as a result of all this podcasting, people started calling you the Podfather, which I love, and asking to take pictures with you at conferences. What is it like to be a celebrity in our industry? Did you ever feel like you had imposter syndrome early on? And if so, what was that like?
The Podfather at like 21 years old, by the way. I have some
21.
pictures
I'm
like on
sorry.
my
I'm sorry.
Facebook. Yeah, no, I'm very young, and I have pictures that people took that are like posted on Facebook, or like they're buried away somewhere. I always felt like, okay, I'm reaching people, but this is kind of a niche industry, and I never ever let it get to my head. I mean, I've always had perspective on that kind of thing, and I listen. I'm a heavy listener to podcasts, so I understand what it means to have a relationship with someone you listen to all the time. So I never let that create an outsized impact on like how I felt about myself. It was very
Mhm.
fulfilling because people would say, "Oh, I got a job in the industry because I listened to the
Yeah.
show, and I used this information in my job interview, or like you helped me with my market research." That stuff is
Mhm.
so fulfilling, and it will always
Yeah.
be fulfilling. Um, what's interesting is that like I kind of have this niche celebrity, but it has expanded a bit because like the climate and clean tech world has expanded dramatically
Yeah.
over the years. So the my presence has changed a little bit, but I have never let that impact the mission or made me feel like too big for my britches. I've
Mm.
always kept it into perspective.
Mm. Did you face feelings of imposter syndrome early on?
Imposter syndrome, yes, definitely. That's the big part of the question. So all the time. I mean, I have the imposter syndrome in my entrepreneurship journey now, which we can talk about.
Mm.
But early on, I was forced to sound like an expert on topics that I didn't really know much about. And the real art was like trying to figure out how to get enough information so that I sounded smart enough and could hang with people who were, truly immersed in this stuff. And
Mm.
that imposter syndrome guided me. It was my real
Mm.
motivation into getting better and better.
Mm. Mm.
um, I have a great story about Ira Ehrenpreis, who's a really famous investor. And early on in my career, they launched like this massive fund, and they had invested in Tesla. This was in 2006, or maybe it was early 2007. And I'm on the phone with him, and I'm trying to sound smart and ask him questions. And he's like, "Do you know how venture capital works? Like, let me just tell you like how it actually works." And he wasn't being mean or anything. It was just
Yeah.
very clear that like, oh, I was a
Yeah.
little out of my depth in terms of understanding how the fund worked and everything. And
Mhm.
uh, so I had moments like that, and
Mhm.
it kind of kicked me down a couple notches. But you just use it as your motivation.
Mm. Your co-hosts on the Energy Gang are Kathryn Hamilton and Trigger Shaw, as you've said. What is it like to work with them? Given as long as you have worked with them, what do you want them to know?
Oh, they are some of the most delightful collaborators and friends that I've ever had the pleasure of knowing and working with. We truly have a magic relationship.
Mm.
The reason why the show is ongoing and will keep going for the foreseeable future, because we all have a relationship that you hear on tape that exists in the real world. And we
Mm.
truly like each other. We truly respect each other. We have a good creative dynamic in that we know our roles on the show. And so it makes selecting topics and figuring out the direction of the show very easy. And the amount of time and commitment that they've put into it, I mean, it
Mm.
requires a lot of their time. And
Mhm.
I mean, I could not speak highly enough of the dedication that they have also put into the show. So, many years ago, someone heard one of our shows, and I think we were all disagreeing and getting angry. And there was this rumor, like, "Is the Energy Gang breaking up?" And and I was like, "No, of course not." And that relationship is truly
Mm.
special, and it will continue onward for the foreseeable future.
Mm. They're awesome. So I think it's a beautiful shout out to them. 2 years after launching the Energy Gang in 2015, you launched the Interchange with Shale Khan, who I think you perfectly describe as the Ezra Klein of clean tech. How did the Interchange come about? And what is it really like working with Shale?
Someone wrote on LinkedIn the other day that the description of the interchange is uh, for those listeners who the Energy Gang isn't wonky enough. And Shale really likes to dig into numbers. He really likes to be thoughtful about having long form conversations about trends that he is thinking about. And so he was then the VP of research at GTM, and we were developing a new show for subscribers only behind the paywall. And that worked well. And we experimented with a few different variations, but we realized that we could we could expand the audience dramatically, and it was probably better financially to monetize the podcast publicly rather than just stick it behind a paywall and have a much smaller audience.
Mhm.
So that was the genesis of the show. And the difference is that we're truly trying to explore, um, in the most fun and wonky way possible, some of these big picture decarbonization topics. And Shale is just an incredible mind. I mean, he has these conversations very often without notes. He can just very succinctly talk about topics, without seemingly any preparation at all. And it's awe inspiring. I mean, I cannot do that. I have to have some bullet points. I have to do some reading. I have to like kind of prepare
Same.
my thoughts. Otherwise, I'll just derail off and, go elsewhere. But he just has this
Mm,
succinct communication style. And he's a dear friend too.
mm,
Truly a very warm, remarkable person. So
mm,
I'm very lucky having co-hosts like that, co-hosts and friends on those two shows.
mm. 2 years ago, amid the booming podcast space, you left Green Tech Media to found Postscript Audio, where you serve as executive producer of both the Energy Gang and the Interchange, which are still distributed by Green Tech Media, as well as new independent shows like A Matter of Degrees. How did you decide to take the leap to become an entrepreneur and start Postscript Audio?
Well, it's a great time to be a producer because
Mm,
everyone's trying to figure out their audio strategy. And media companies are launching podcasts left and right. Organizations are realizing that the relationships that you create with podcast co-hosts are really strong. And so a lot of people are listening to podcasts now and they realize how important and valuable they can be. So we were just
mhm,
getting a lot of inbound requests on how do I make a show? What should
mhm,
I do? What's my strategy? And it was very clear that I had this level of production expertise and management expertise to launch our own production outfit. At that same time, in the 2017 to 2018 timeframe, there were dozens and dozens of other small shops like ours popping up, many
mm,
covering different facets, different types of topics. And so it, there's a reason for that. And that is because audio is such a booming medium right now.
mhm.
I really felt like we had a certain level of expertise to help launch new shows.
I would definitely agree with that, given our experience with what it takes. You decided not to raise capital for Postscript Audio, which is now an 8-person team. You still only pay yourself a modest salary, hopefully more than $27,000, but still modest. Why did you decide not to raise capital? And then what are the biggest challenges that you've faced in launching in launching the business over the past 2 years?
Well, to be perfectly honest, the reason why we haven't raised money is because I think we're still figuring out the business model. And if I went to a venture, if I would not give me money right now. And by that, I mean, I think we've shown like we have a very successful process in place. We've
Mm,
got some really great shows that I'm proud of, but we're still figuring out the exact direction of like what the totality of shows that we take on. What is that going to look like?
mhm,
The business model is still varied in terms of how we
mm,
fund shows.
mhm,
Our production model is very much based on raising budgets, and
mhm,
we're focused a lot on advertising revenue right now.
mhm,
And so that
mhm,
can be a bit of a stop start industry. So we're trying to reorient the business to figure out how to get better recurring revenue, how to get some of our shows to even bigger scale, and monetize those differently. And so I think in the next year or so, we're in talks now about like how to reorient the company. So I think that's the reason why. I was just sort of having an honest description of, or an honest take, and that is
mm.
we're still figuring it out.
Yep.
Um, the what was the other part of the question?
Oh, just the hardest parts.
Well, the hardest parts are that all your faults are now everybody else's problem.
That's intense. Yeah.
I mean, like,
Yeah.
if you're responsible for a lot of other people,
Mm, mhm,
your your management style matters so much more. The
mhm,
stakes are much higher, and you have to constantly be reevaluating your vision and having, impressing that internally and having other people press that. So, I found it very difficult. I think that ultimately we've been able to execute given what we knew we wanted to do in the first 2 years, but
Mhm.
there's a lot of things that you don't have to ever think about when you're just a manager within another organization.
This all is resonating very deeply with me, and I'm sure with every entrepreneur. Um, Speaking of podcasting at scale, at Postscript Audio, you've developed custom audio campaigns for Fortune 500 brands, including GE, AES, most recently Google. What role do corporations play in the podcast world, and what role do they play in your mind in addressing the climate crisis?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the two answers to that. One is a lot of the campaigns that we're doing are a great way to fund editorial series. So
Mm,
many companies don't want to launch their own shows. So you can go and say, we can develop this limited run series, or we can do custom shows that we then put into other podcast feeds. And that's a very popular product. And in the clean tech and climate world, it's a product that's very successful because a
mm,
lot of the folks who are focused on that subject are not going to be turned off by a lot of the messaging of
mhm,
corporates. I mean, they may understand that it's an ad or it's a branded podcast, but it resonates very differently than,
mm,
if someone's selling you socks or if someone's selling you any other, retail good.
mhm,
Um, so because the relationship in podcasting is very unique with the host, and people are really going to, like, if they see something appear in their feed, they're probably going to listen to it. I think that they play a strong role in the overall monetization strategy. Ultimately, we want to use some of those projects to fund some of the bigger independent editorial projects. In terms of
mhm,
clean tech, I mean, I've always
mm,
believed from the very beginning, one of the things that attracted me to business reporting was that companies were the first movers. You know,
mhm,
I think that there are a lot of bad corporate actors out there that have tried to prevent the energy transition, but there are a lot of companies that have been at the forefront of making this happen. And it was so clear to me early on that economics, business, and finance were really compelling arguments for the energy transition that could break through a lot of the traditional political arguments. And so I strongly believe in the role of corporates in helping guide this transition.
yeah, agreed. Over the past 12 years now, you have launched 5 shows that have collectively received over 11 million downloads. If you were to summarize the one thing based on all of that experience that people should know about podcasting, what would it be?
Oh my gosh, so many. I mean, you have to have a plan, right? The shows we've launched that have been successful, we've put a lot of thought into. We're not just
Mm.
setting up microphones and saying, okay, we've got two people who are good at talking here, let's do it. It's a
Mhm,
very clear plan of why you're developing a show, how is it going to differentiate from any other show, what is the role of the co-hosts, how is this thing going to sound, how are you going to integrate interviews. There's a lot of thought that goes into it, just like any other complicated medium. And
mm,
podcasting in general is accessible to a lot of people, which is one of its greatest strengths. But it
mhm,
also means that a lot of people show up thinking that they're going to set up a couple microphones and it's going to work great and they're going to have a hit podcast, and it just doesn't work. So any of the successful shows that we've launched have had months and months of work that go into them to figure out what it is, what are we going to do with it, and why is it going to land.
mm, mhm. Makes sense. You are now an entrepreneur. What have you learned about entrepreneurship since launching Postscript Audio?
Well, echoing my previous sentiment, it is extremely difficult because a lot rests on me and my idiosyncrasies and the responsibility that you have as an entrepreneur to members of the team. And thinking about scale is also a challenge.
Mm,
I very much am a creative person and I like to be involved in projects. And sometimes that can distract me from thinking about some of the bigger picture stuff. And I have to be able to manage those two things. I think that's probably the case for a lot of entrepreneurs. And that's why, you have people at companies who go from CEO into some other role because they realize, like, oh, maybe I'm not CEO, like I'm much better at running the engineering team, or I'm much better at product development. And so I think that's what I'm grappling with, is I really like
mhm,
to be involved in the creative process, but I also know that I have to make all these bigger decisions. COVID threw a lot out the window. I mean, the schedule this year has been really tough for planning, but
Yeah.
I suspect even in a normal world that that tension would still be there.
Yeah. As far as you've seen so much of podcasting over the 14 years that you've been in it, how has it changed and evolved, and where is it going from here?
The I mean, it's there's big money in it now, and the factories of podcasts into IP for Hollywood is really fascinating, and it means that all the big media organizations are launching podcasts left and right with the idea of turning podcasts into a hit Netflix series or some kind of film. And so at one end of the spectrum, podcasts are this really interesting experimentation tool where you
Mm,
can, at a fairly minimal budget compared to what it would take to develop a pilot series, test out an idea and then send it off to other creative agencies.
mhm,
So like that's one end of the spectrum, and that's why a lot of big money is getting into it. Um, on the other end of the spectrum, there are record numbers of podcasts being developed every year. And
mhm,
we now, I think, have almost 1.5 million podcasts that have been logged by Spotify and
mm,
Apple. And because the medium is so accessible, the recording equipment is a lot cheaper, and the distribution is very easy. There's a lot of noise out there right now.
mm,
And so, even if you're launching a show with fairly high quality and a good budget behind it, it's a lot harder to make a splash.
mhm,
So the
mm,
big money folks are dominating the top Apple charts, and they are
mhm,
dominating listener attention. You have a lot of smaller podcasts that are making the space a lot more crowded, and shows in
mm,
the middle market with like fairly decent budgets can stand out, but it takes a ton more money and a ton more time to make those shows stand out. We were lucky for with the Energy Gang, and even with the earlier podcast at Renewable Energy World, we
mm,
were first movers. So we got an audience overnight almost.
mm,
And what you find is some of the bigger podcasts that are just like talk shows have huge audiences because they were in it at the very early stage. And a lot of the shows that are similar to them don't have a big audience because it's a lot harder to break out. So that's the
mm,
biggest challenge right now. The
mhm,
strength is that a lot of people can get in it, and the drawback is that it's harder
mm.
to get seen.
Mhm. Well, I'm happy you've been in it for as long as you have and are taking it in the direction that you're going with Postscript Audio. Podcasting has been such a through line through your life and your career, all the way through to your marriage. I know you met your wife through your podcast. Tell me that story. Like, how did you meet?
Are we at the meet cute now?
We're
Is
at
this
the meet.
the
Yep,
meet cute moment?
that's
Yeah.
right. That's right.
Podcasts are a huge part of my relationship with my wife. Back when I was developing my first podcast, my wife was listening. She was at Tufts, and she was
Before you
listening
met.
to the before we met, and
Mhm.
she listened to the show while running, and she reached out randomly to ask about internships or jobs in the space, and we had an email exchange going, and I said, oh well, I'm actually coming to Boston for a conference, like let's meet up. And a friend came with me, and the three of us had drinks and dinner and ended up staying out most of the night, and we really hit it off, and it was very clear that there was a spark there. But we went our separate ways, and she went off to do great things in government and in the energy space, and we would trade some emails. And I think we have one email, it's like, hey, what are you seeing for lithium ion battery pricing? And so that was the relationship, and then we lost contact. And
Mm.
um, in 2015, the Facebook algorithm connected us, and we reconnected and started messaging. And in fact, I had a video of me on the dance floor going kind of wild. And she just wrote in the comments, is it possible to fall in love with someone through a dance video?
That's
And
the cutest.
then we started talking to each other. And I was like, oh, I'm going on another reporting trip in Boston. We should meet up again. And it was very clear from the start when we rekindled that relationship that like there was something there. And within months, I had packed up from DC and moved to Boston and started our relationship, and then we were married in 2017.
It's the most romantic podcast story I've ever heard.
Well, now
It's
she's
really
really
sweet.
sick of hearing me talk about podcasting, but we'll always hang our hats on that lovely story.
It's a really good story. This June, you celebrated your first Father's Day as a dad. Father's Day came 100 days after quarantine, and I'm wondering if you would be willing to read what you wrote on Twitter on June 21st of this year on Father's Day.
Sure. Yeah, this is fairly heavy. We're going from light to heavy here.
Yeah,
Let me bring this up.
thanks.
When coronavirus hit, I was in serious mental anguish. My brother had just died suddenly. I was struggling with being a new father. I stopped exercising. I stopped sleeping. I turned to alcohol. I would start my work days at 3 a.m. and work late at night. I became deranged. It was impossible for me to distinguish between small and big things. I couldn't let anything go. I was filled with tension and anger all the time. A therapist told me I was manic. He suggested I take lithium for the mania. This was all hidden from my professional life behind a microphone. Then the lockdown hit. I hunkered down with my wife and baby in a frenzied state. I had a clear choice: do something about my mental health or face unknown consequences. It frightened me to think about how I would act in a state of lockdown, the way I was taking care of myself. No childcare, losing business, no leaving the house, a recipe for disaster, right? But then something happened. Somehow, the confines of the situation created an opportunity for me to get my mind straight. The lack of choice, or the clarity of choice, was a blessing. I forced myself to sleep. My half work, half parenting days forced me to work more intelligently. I abandoned all alcohol and enhancing substances except caffeine. I slowly cleaned up my diet and I created a regimented exercise routine. Totally simple and ridiculously obvious stuff, right? It's hard to describe the radical changes to my psyche I've seen over the last 100 days. I re engineered my brain. I'm much closer to the person I want to be for my wife and little girl, the person that I know I am.
It gives me chills hearing it. I feel like it takes a lot of courage and bravery to share something like that with yourself, let alone the world. What's it like hearing that now?
Um, well, it's a reminder of how much work I had to put in and still have to put in during these really difficult times. It's pretty emotional because I definitely became a person that I didn't expect to become. I mean, the lack of sleep and the stress around having a new baby and um, just not taking care of myself was threw me in a completely unexpected direction, and it took me a long time to dig out of that hole. And then every week I had to come behind the microphone and put on the Stephen Lacey face that people know and hear, and that was very difficult. um I mean, it reminds me of the work that I still have to do, right? I'm constantly striving in my personal life and even as an entrepreneur to put the work in to get closer to that person that I know I am.
Hmm. For someone who is where you were at your worst in that description, what would you want them to know?
That it doesn't have to be this hard, that you don't have to hold on to so many things. My biggest weakness is that I hold on to things so tightly, and I can let them spiral. And that can often be a very good strength in an entrepreneur, in that, like, I really
Mm,
care about each and every detail. I have like a running list in my head of the things that I need to do, and I'm able to pick and choose from that list. But what happens and what happened during this period is that I just have a list of things, many of which are not important, some of which are very
mm,
important, and I can't distinguish between them. And so I need to constantly remind myself of like how to better prioritize, because that is a big piece of that inability to prioritize can be a big piece of how I mentally spiral.
mm. I think it's such a common experience for so many people, and yet it's something that's often stigmatized, and we feel like we can't talk about it. And I think one of your greatest strengths is your willingness to be vulnerable in a way that is relatable because everyone's facing struggles, and to have somebody who you admire and respect share theirs is really powerful and meaningful. So I think on behalf of a lot of people, I want to thank you for being willing to share.
Thank
The
you.
last question, of course, for our high voltage round is, as part of your mental health, your physical health, exercise is really important to you. You used to do competitive powerlifting. You can deadlift 500 pounds. I recently started lifting during the shutdown. I'm deadlifting 135 pounds. So I'm curious what advice you have for me.
Uh, Actually, it's 600 pounds.
600. Oh man, get these
Not
facts right.
now. That was a few years ago. So
That's
I
amazing.
should tell people, some people might confuse powerlifting with bodybuilding.
Hmm.
They are
Hmm.
not the same thing. So it's lifting for strength instead of aesthetics.
Hmm.
Um, well, first of all, let me just say that strength training and just physical exercise has been so important for orienting my mental health. I mean, I know it's really cliche. It's one of the reasons why so many people in Silicon Valley talk about optimizing health. And there's, there's often this like desire to get away from the, grind yourself into the ground attitude and like take a step back and focus on your nutrition and your sleeping and your physical health. All that stuff works. And there's a reason why, even though it can sometimes be cliche, people are focused on it. So for me, it's been hugely beneficial. Some of that has taken a hit, particularly in the last like 6 months in terms of physical exercise because of the number of productions that we have going on, but it's always there as a central tool.
Hmm.
Um, I don't I don't often talk about this, but when I was competitive powerlifting, I deadlifted 600 pounds, squatted 500 pounds, and bench pressed 345 pounds.
That's
So
wild.
I was 50 pounds heavier than I am now. So you're seeing a much different version of Stephen Lacey when all that was happening. But anyway, the physical exercise piece is so crucial, I think, to good performance.
Mm.
In terms of advice for you, what are your goals? I mean, are you looking to deadlift 600 pounds?
No, that I don't think that's going to be possible. But like I don't know, progressing like 5 pounds every time, and so this is I have a estimated 166 total, but I haven't tried it yet.
Well,
So
it's really impressive. Maybe we should start a nutrition or a weight training
oh,
podcast together,
I'm
and we
into
can.
it. I'm into it. Yeah, yeah. I like it. Oh, that's also for 5 reps. 5 reps. I want to make that clear.
Nice. That's great. That's really
Oh, thank
good.
you. Thank
One
you.
of the things that's kept me healthy is outside of this door in this closet, I actually have a
Mm.
gym that's been built. I have a powerlifting gym like with a ton of weights. So that's really helped me during lockdown.
Awesome. We are going to transition into our high voltage round. These are quick questions with about 10-second answers. As you know, the first question is if you were to be an animal, what animal would you be and why? But I don't want you to answer yet. I want to tell you that I asked Kathryn, Jigger, and Shale what animal they think you would be. So I'm going to tell you all three animals, and then I want you to choose who you think said
Oh,
each animal.
okay,
So the
that's
three
good.
animals
I like
are a
it.
badger, a wolf, and a dolphin.
Jigger said badger. Kathryn said wolf. Uh, what's the third one? A dolphin?
Dolphin, yeah.
Shale said dolphin.
You got Shale right. So Shale said dolphin because you are very smart, kind of hyper, and you wake up early in the morning. But Kathryn and Jigger, you got flipped. Kathryn said you're a badger, quote, for obvious reasons. And Jigger said you're a wolf, you're very social, but also value your alone time.
Yes,
But what is your actual animal?
I chose the lyrebird, which is an Australian bird that can mimic any sound.
Wow.
It can mimic any sort of machinery. It can mimic other birds or animals, and even sometimes mimic human voice. And the reason why I chose it is because to be a good interviewer, and really just a good human being, you have to be able to mimic the other person in a way that gets them to open up. And so I thought
Mm,
that was really appropriate. And I
I love
picked the
that.
lyrebird because my daughter is really into birds, and we have a bunch of bird books. And I've always been fascinated by the lyrebird. Um, in her bird book, and so I thought its attributes were very appropriate for what makes a good skill set for an interviewer.
It sounds perfect. You were the first and only What It Takes Lyrebird. Um, Next question is if you had to start a new career tomorrow, what would it be?
I would probably be a ski bum working as a lift attendant and writing magazine articles
What kind of articles?
about skiing or about action sports or about nature and like hiking and like an editor at Outside Magazine or something, like testing out ski gear and working in the cafeteria at a ski mountain.
Sounds awesome. Other than yourself, to whom do you attribute your success?
Oh, my wife has been huge in really promoting my success, and she has a lot of entrepreneurial she has a lot of entrepreneurial bones in her body, and she gave me the opportunity to exercise mine first. So I'll always be
Mm.
grateful for that. In addition, I have two mentors, Scott Clavenna, the co-founder of
Woo,
Green Tech
Scott,
Media,
former What
who
It Takes
is an
guest.
extraordinary human being, and then Jim Callahan, who is the co-founder of Renewable Energy World. Both of them were very much like father figures to me and
Mm.
gave me extraordinary opportunities and were true friends who gave
Mm.
me the best advice possible. So the qualities that you would look for in a mentor, they both had through and through.
Mm. When have you failed?
Well, I know that everybody says I fail regularly, and I feel like I do. I mean, I think that going back to the struggles with mental health, I feel like if I'm at my depths and I'm unable to pull myself out of them, I feel like I'm failing. Um, that's not a good feeling to have. And luckily, I've developed the tools to try to get beyond that. Um, we've launched some bad podcasts too. So we failed there. And sometimes when I'm not giving proper direction to people and I'm assuming that someone has all the information and I'm not being as communicative as I could be, I think I'm failing then. And I really I really want to be a better manager and someone who is giving people the tools all the time to do their best work. And when I don't do that, it really makes me reevaluate myself.
Mm. What is the best investment you've ever made?
Definitely Sandy, my wife. I think for the reasons that I identified above, she's been extremely supportive. The other is the powerlifting gym that I have over next to me. I mean, just we have like 1,000 pounds of weights in there and kettlebells and all sorts of stuff. I'm taking up the entire basement by putting my recording studio and gym down here, and so my wife has been very good about giving up that space. But that is just absolutely crucial for maintaining my mental health. So those are the two best investments. They go hand in hand.
What is something that you thought was true that you no longer believe?
That I'm a chill person. Apparently, I'm a badger. I used to think I was chill, and I know that I'm very much not a chill person.
Mm.
And I really I grew up with very much ingrained in kind of the counterculture movement. I was fascinated by the counterculture movement, and I listened to a lot of like Grateful Dead, and I just thought I was this chill person. And in reality, I look back at who I was over time and who I am now, and I'm very much a very neurotic person.
It's good to be self-aware. If you could change one thing about the world, what would it be?
Disinformation. I would change the vulnerability of human psychology. I'm really dismayed by the world we live in and how easily manipulated people are. And I would want to give us the more mental tools to not be so easily manipulated. One of those is podcasts.
Woo! If there was just one person who was going to hear this podcast, who would you want it to be?
Can I pick two?
Sure.
My brother, who died just a few weeks before lockdown, who for 2 decades struggled with severe mental health issues and addiction issues. We lived the opioid crisis firsthand in the darkest ways for many, many years. And I just there were a lot of times when I didn't see my brother or talk to him, and he always said how proud I made him. But I would just want him to hear how things are going, because I'll never get to talk to him again. I would also want my daughter Acadia to listen to this as well, because I want her to know that the time I'm spending doing my work is to try to do some good in the world and help give other people the tools to create exponential change.
Other people have cried on the podcast. I have not yet cried on the podcast, but this is the closest that I've come. Those are great, really, really beautiful answers. Um, Finish these sentences for me. Companies fail because.
They can't adapt, they have the wrong business model, or they're blinded by their own hubris.
Hmm. If you really knew me, you would know.
That there's another side to me.
Success is.
Whatever you want to make it. Success is feeling happy and comfortable with yourself.
Hmm. If I could have done one thing differently, I would have.
I would have taken an internship with Ken Burns. Ken Burns lives in Walpole, New Hampshire. We have a connection to him and Dayton Duncan, who's his producer. And when I was young, I had the opportunity to do an internship with him. If most people know him, he's a famous documentarian, and I got to go to his studio and see things and do a tour. And I had the opportunity to go be an intern, but I was young and wanted to make my own films, and I was worried that I was just going to go serve him coffee, and I let
Hmm.
someone talk me out of it,
Hmm.
and I think it would have opened up a lot of other doors, and I think that's kind of a regret. um I would have taken that opportunity.
Hmm.
Ultimately, I mean, my pathway was great, so I don't really
Hmm.
regret it, but I
Hmm.
that's a choice I should have made.
Hmm. Hmm. If the world knew me for one thing, it would be.
My voice.
Check. I'm most proud of.
Helping other people find purpose and understanding in the energy and climate space in particular, where they're using that information in vastly more impactful ways.
Hmm. Last question. To build a successful company, what it takes is.
Relentlessness in an unrelenting world.